Hi, my name is Girish Daswani. Welcome to the Everyday Orientalism podcast series. We're here to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Everyday Orientalism, a public platform through which students, academics, and citizens reflect on how history and power shape the ways in which human societies define themselves. The platform foregrounds the histories and political struggles that those in power often seek to erase. Defined by Palestinian-American literary scholar Edward Said, Orientalism is a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. Featuring a stellar lineup of guests, we explore how Orientalism continues to have deep ramifications in our everyday lives, for how we think about settler colonialism, liberation, and how empire and capitalism continue to exploit and dehumanize the majority of us. It was April 1st, 2024. Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza was broadcasted on our screens, and the University of Toronto, or UFT, had been ignoring student demands for disclosure and divestment for months. Left with few options, students occupied the president's office to force a meeting with him. When they finally met, UFT President Merrick Gertler claimed not to know about the scholasticide going on in Gaza. At the time, all of Gaza's 12 universities had been destroyed. He told students that there was a diversity of opinion on the issue. On May 2nd, over 60 students set up a protest encampment on the grass of UFT's front campus, which they called the People's Circle for Palestine. These students were speaking back to the systemic occlusions of settler colonialism and the neoliberal story of university education as individualized success. For 62 days, the Occupy UFT encampment challenged the university administration and their strategies of misinformation, tirelessly responding on social media and through press conferences, community events, and teach-ins. Student organizers spoke back to the university's lies and defended against increasing violence from white supremacist, pro-settler colonial groups. U of T, in response, accused the peaceful multi-faith encampment of being violent and anti-Semitic, and sought an injunction to allow police to forcibly remove them. On July 2nd, 2024, the Ontario Superior Court of Justice declared the camp peaceful and found no evidence of anti-Semitism, hate speech, or violence from student protesters. UFT's administration reacted to the encampment by turning facts that there is a genocide in Gaza, that UFT has investments in companies that profit from apartheid, war, and illegal occupation, that the encampment was peaceful and inclusive, into opinions. What happens, as Hannah Arendt argued in her 1967 essay Truth and Politics, when factual truth becomes a matter of opinion? As Palestinian writer and activist Mohammed El-Kurd reminds us, history tells us that those who have oppressed, who have monopolized and institutionalized violence, will not tell the truth, let alone hold themselves accountable. The genocide in Gaza has revealed the fault lines of authoritarianism and fascism, as well as the role universities play in these systems of inclusion and oppression, not only through the suppression of student protest and freedom of association, but also by recourse to lies and the normalization of settler colonial whiteness. The genocide says a lot about the lies we have grown up with, including the colonial fantasy of Western civilization, and our respect for human rights, and how universities project the fantasy of diversity, decolonization, and inclusivity. If anything, we have been reminded in no uncertain terms that the university in North America is an extension of settler colonial history, and to quote Native American activist scholar Sandy Grant, mirroring its histories of dispossession, enslavement, exclusion, forced assimilation, and integration. The university's response to the student encampment revealed that talk of diversity and a politics of recognition cannot bring change to a settler colonial system, especially when the university as an institution reproduces configurations of settler colonial and capitalist power. If the university is a site of struggle, of refusal, of contradiction, how do we reconcile the contradictions of belonging to institutions that promote DEI policies and decolonization agendas, while being unable to divest from the military-industrial complex profiting from genocides in Gaza and the Sudan and illegal wars in Iran? Drawing on the work of American historian Robin D.G. Kelley, and Dene Canadian scholar Glenn Coulthard, Sandy Grant writes that not only is the university beyond reform, but that reformist strategies are, to quote her, complicit in the struggle against anti-black racism, and that recognition-based politics impede Indigenous struggles for decolonization. The university's DEI policies, decolonization and anti-racist projects are motivated by liberal agendas that acknowledge difference, but that do nothing to change the underlying systems of institutional harm, capitalist extraction, and settler colonial violence. What is the role of the university? What is the role of the intellectual in this time of gangster imperialism and genocide? If capitalism and the settler colonial state remain at the center of universities and their relations, how can our institutions truly change or be held accountable? Students protesting a genocide were part of that university. At the same time, they were also gesturing to another university. Through their courageous stances, these students refused the university as it is shaped by UFT's white and increasingly Zionist and corporate elite. Instead, they affirmed that they, the students, are the university. In their refusal to compromise in their negotiations with the university administration, they demonstrated that they were not seeking equal opportunity in a burning house. Instead, they wanted to build a new house that divested from genocide. What does it mean to recreate the conditions of our relations in ways that are not built on colonialism and capitalist extraction and death? Can we dream of another university built on anti-capitalist, feminist, and anti-colonial futures? With us today are three scholars from whom these questions are central. Beverly Bain is a black queer radical feminist scholar, anti-capitalist, activist, organizer, abolitionist, and public intellectual. She has over 40 years of experience in feminist anti-violence and anti-racism communities in Canada and globally. Bain is published in numerous books and journals, including Queer Canadian 2nd edition, We Still Demand, Redefining Resistance in Sex and Gender Struggles, and Canadian Women's Studies, Fireweed, and The Conversation. Rinaldo Walcott is Professor and Chair of Africana and American Studies at the University of Buffalo. His research is in the area of Black diaspora cultural studies, gender and sexuality, with interests in nations, nationalisms, multiculturalism, policy, and education broadly defined. His most recent books include The Long Emancipation, Moving Towards Freedom from Duke University Press in 2021, and On Property, Policing, Prisons, and the Call for Abolition from Biblioasis in 2021. Uahikea Maile is a Kanaka Maoli scholar, strategist, and practitioner from Maunawili on the island of Oahu. He's assistant professor in the Department of Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity at the University of Chicago. Maile's forthcoming book with Duke University Press is entitled Gifts of Sovereignty, Capitalism, Settler Colonialism, and Indigenous Politics in Hawaii. They are the Vice President of Red Media, Research Fellow with the Yellowhead Institute, and a member of the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective and Hui Aloha Aina. Welcome, the three of you. I'm so happy to have you here. Thank you for being here, Beverly, Rinaldo, and Uahikea. All three of you are activists and intellectuals who are critical of the university, while also situated within the university. How do each of you, at this present moment, situate or see yourself within the university? And has your relationship to the university changed more recently? Let me ask Beverly to go first, and then Rinaldo, and then Uahikea.
Thank you, Girish, and hello to Uahikea and Rinaldo, two of my favorite people. I am really happy to be in conversation with all of you. So thank you. And thank you, Girish, for bringing us together. I want to first start by saying, when I think of the university, first and foremost, I came to the university much later in life. So this is an important historical piece for me to give, because it tells you how I entered the university. I came to the university first as an activist, from an activist position. After graduating from university in the 70s, I'm aging myself here, in the 70s, early 80s, actually, 82 was when I graduated from U of T. I had no intention of going back to university. I was never interested in becoming an academic. That was never my dream or my goal. I knew right then that I wanted to do something to contribute to changing the world we lived in, because the world, as we witness it today, it's dire. But there were moments in our world where it's been dire for many of us, as Black people, as Indigenous people, as Palestinians, etc. There are moments when it has been dire. So I grew up in a context of post-colonialism, or what we will call neo-colonialism, I would call it, when at a time, and I became a teenager at the time, 1969, at the turn of the Black Power struggle, when the world was on fire. When the world was on fire in terms of Black uprising, right? It was happening in the US, it was happening in the Caribbean. It started for me from the 70s. I started reading newspapers and books, and I had access to that. And I was always an avid reader. And I grew up conscientized in a way, always wanting to know and to do something, and not happy with the state of the world, with the state of how Black people were treated in the world in particular. Right? Because I witnessed, I saw around me where Black young people were being brutalized by the police for protesting racism, but also protesting labor issues, protesting the way that workers and the unemployed were treated. So I grew up in that context. And when I saw, what was happening in Montreal, I also saw that there was an uprising in the US. There was this Angela Davis. She was plastered all over the newspaper as the number one terrorist in the world at the time in the United States, and I was filled with that information. I was familiar with, Che Guevara and with Fidel Castro, because I had access to those books. My father was an avid reader. He would not have called himself a socialist, but he certainly was very liberal. So I knew then and there that I wanted to do something different. So by the time I was finished university, I had no interest in staying, because I discovered while in university, I became an anti-apartheid activist in the university, protesting, when at the time, the foreign minister, or anyway, the South African minister, was brought to...
Yes, I remember that. We actually have an episode that talks about that.
Well, I was actually part of that protest, right? That was in 1982. I think it was. Mm-hmm. Also, I came to know about Shatila and Sabra in 1982, when Palestinians in Shatila and Sabra were attacked and shot and massacred. I came to know that in 1982. So I've always known about Palestine and what was happening and the connection between Black struggle and Palestine. So as time went on, I became an activist in this city, anti-racism policing, anti-Black racism organizing, anti-police organizing, feminism. I ran the largest feminist organization at the time, the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, which no longer exists. So, I did a lot. And then at some point, I decided that I needed something a little more that would enrich my intellectual, theoretical knowledge. Mm-hmm. I decided, well, what would do that? And I decided, maybe I should go back to university and do, graduate work. And I thought, well, what would I want to do in graduate studies? And the only thing that I thought of was women and gender studies, because I worked in feminism for so long. I worked in feminism abroad. And that was my introduction to the kind of, work that I continue to do and teach today. And then I went back to university. I did graduate work. And then, of course, I end up teaching as contract faculty, all of that period, which is like 20 years. Mm-hmm. But then what I realized is that at some point, very, very early, I became very disenchanted with wanting to be a tenured professor. That I liked actually being on the fringes, not because that is how we should be in the institution, but I already knew that I didn't fit within the institutional norms. Okay. I was an interloper in that institution, in the university. I recognized right away the way in which all of these things, such as diversity, such as inclusion, all of that, we fought in the feminist movement, the way it got taken up, because that was never the intention. The way it got taken up in institutions was never to undermine and to erode, but it was intended to shift and change some of the neo-colonial dynamics in institutions. Yeah. That was not what was happening. And the person who really helped me to understand that clearly is the work of Rinaldo Walcott. I mean, his theoretical work, which I think is brilliant in terms of helping us to understand and to take apart the way that language and performativity and the way that how these are taken up in an institution, also helped me to recognize that being in this institution was not, I couldn't be in this institution in the way that it is. In order for me to be here, I had to do something differently. Mm-hmm. And that is why, I created Scholar Strike for Liberation. So I'll stop there.
That's a very good place to pause, because you just introduced our next speaker, Rinaldo Walcott.
First, it's a pleasure to be here with Bev, whom I've known for a long while, and Uahikea, who I got to know a little bit while you were at U of T, and Girish, whose presence and interventions I admire so much. I mean, if the question is how did I come to the university, sadly or unfortunately for me, my story is much more, much more normative, if you will. I began my undergraduate studies at York University here in Toronto, and towards the end of those undergraduate studies was flailing around for something that I would do. And a couple of friends of mine said, well, it looks like you're going to have to get a government job. And that freaked me out. And I immediately asked, well, what else can I do? And they both had said that they had applied to go to graduate school to do master's degrees. And I was like, where do you go and do that? And they sent me up to a floor in the building at York. And when I got there, they said applications were closed. But then the administrator said, there's this place called Oise, and they take applications all year round. You should check them out. So sure enough, I did. I checked them out and they were taking applications, and I applied. And so I finished my undergraduate degree in August, began my graduate education in September. And so I went straight from the undergraduate degree into graduate education, and straight out of my graduate education into my first job. So in some ways, I'm an institutional animal. But I think that what has saved me is that from my undergraduate education to my graduate education, I have had the luck of encountering amazing teachers, amazing mentors who have always been critical of the university, and they brought me into that orbit. At York University in the late 80s, early 90s, I began graduate school in 1990, and I finished in 1995 and began my first job back at York in 1995. Folks who were teaching Caribbean studies, African American history, what at the time they were calling Commonwealth literature, but also in that period it shifted to post-colonial literature. I was exposed to a range of thinkers who were engaged in those studies, but also the burgeoning work of women of color feminism. And so all of that came together to shape my relationship to the university. So I never saw the university as a place of sanctuary. I always knew that the university was a battleground, because the people who taught me were doing battle in the university themselves.
Yes.
And they weren't just doing battle in the university, they have a place in the university. They were doing battle in the university because they understood that the knowledges that the university created were central to the kinds of social lives that we would live in the university and beyond the university. So that's how I came to the university. And because I'm a student of Black study and Black studies, I know and I understand fully that the university is a significant pillar of social regulation. And that those of us who come from communities of the marginalized, if we're in the university, we kind of have a responsibility to acknowledge that we are in a space that might offer us some kind of fictive autonomy, but that also has a lot of limits to that autonomy, and that we have to really think strategically about how we use that space. So I don't really consider myself an activist. I know too many people who are activists and what that demands of you. But I consider myself someone engaged in the struggle to limit the harms of the university. Because I know that, I've been in the department where the guy down the corridor was doing research for the police union. So I understand what the university holds within it and what the university is deployed to do in relationship to our social lives. And so I see my role in the university as attending to that harm and exposing that harm. But I also see my role in the university as, in this sense, to undo the ways in which the university tries also to contain our age that we might imagine another world. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks, Rinaldo. Uahikea, how do you situate yourself at this present moment in the university? Has your relationship to the university changed?
Just to echo my lovely colleagues, to say mahalo for bringing us together, Girish. And it's a pleasure to be in conversation with Bev and Rinaldo, two folks that I really admire, and especially want to shout out Rinaldo for being one of the first new colleagues of mine at U of T during the first week of being scared and in Canada and Toronto for the first time, meeting at the former Image Center at the recently renamed TMU, former Ryerson University. Rinaldo, as a quick story, just kind of came up to me and just introduced themselves, and I was alone, and it was really nice to be brought into conversation with some other folks there through Rinaldo. So that always stays with me. So mahalo for that. I find increasingly that it's useful to disidentify with belonging in the university. I've always had a nagging and lingering feeling of unbelonging, and I think that that actually is really productive. And it's been productive for me and generative across primarily spaces where I've been employed at the university instead of those spaces where I've been a student or interacted with the university in other kinds of ways. So I do recall joining the Department of Political Science fresh out of graduate school from a PhD in American Studies at the University of New Mexico with my classmates, Nick Estes, who's a Lakota historian, Melanie Yazzie, who's a Dene feminist political thinker, and others, where we were building a indigenous student movement while in class studying and writing and doing research. And so entering the professoriate in another country was alienating. But what grounded me were those people who I fought alongside and the kinds of orientations to the university in disidentifying with it, really, even as students, that I wanted to bring to bear as a worker at the University of Toronto. With that said, I would situate myself as someone that doesn't feel like they totally belong in the university space as a professor. And I think that it's primarily because of some things that I've learned from Rinaldo. And Rinaldo said it previously, but mentioned it again. There were folks that I was working with in the Faculty of Arts and Science at the University of Toronto that didn't see me as human. And were actually actively trying to build a development project on a sacred mountain to Kanaka Maoli, to Native Hawaiians, just down the street from my office. So I was able to quickly be ingratiated by that reality. I'll never forget being at Mauna Kea at 6,000 feet at a indigenous blockade in Hawaii, protecting our sacred mountain from desecration and destruction again, because at the time there were already a number of telescope observatories that existed and still exist today. So this would just be another one, the 30-meter telescope, that is, that the University of Toronto's been a original university partner in the larger consortium. And in July 2019, after signing my contract and starting my work employment with the university, a professor from the Department of Astronomy over Twitter, I believe, began to launch a campaign against my public advocacy as a colleague, and eventually dipped into my DMs and emails and asked for consultation with me once I would arrive to Toronto. And that was the kind of introduction, so to speak, of what belonging to the university meant for me as a worker and an employee at the University of Toronto, was that I learned who down the corridor was benefiting from the dehumanization of myself as an Indigenous person, and also the advocacy for a development project that would actively push for the criminalization and incarceration of me and my people. And eventually 33 of our elders were detained and arrested just in that moment in July 2019. And so astronomers in Canada and in Toronto were actively involved in pushing for this project that then would be necessarily needing to be opened up for construction by removing us, removing our kupuna, and seeking to eliminate our relationship with this place So in addition to finding those to fight, I also found a lot of people to fight alongside as a worker at the University of Toronto in various capacities. And so one of the ways that I've been really heartened by the situating of disidentificatory practices as being a part of the university is just finding community to engage in shared struggle for all kinds of purposes. And this is one of the things that really gives me a lot of life in general. And, you know, one of my colleagues that I mentioned previously, Nick Estes, has always said that this is kind of like what he believes is the pure life, a life of struggle. And it's hard to get free, but it's also, as he says, hard to reemerge and become human on the other side. And so freedom itself after the struggle is still a struggle, according to him. And I really believe that. And I've learned that from others like Rinaldo and Bev and you too, Girish. And I will say that at the University of Toronto, just to be specific, I hoped to leverage my position in a department that was incredibly hostile, which I knew from the beginning. And I will say here, because it's kind of funny, that when I first got my offer from the University of Toronto's Department of Political Science, I rejected it outright. And then they came back to, you know, plead that I negotiate with them. And at the time, I was waiting on other opportunities, thinking that it would be possible for me to go home through a job. And it didn't materialize. So eventually I said yes. And again, this is why I was grieving when I first got there and why Rinaldo was so kind to me. And it really meant a lot. But while there, you know, I saw myself as a kind of insurgent mole, trying to redistribute space and resources and be a bulwark for those in the Department of Political Science, which I mentioned is incredibly hostile, especially to Indigenous students, Black students, other racialized students, queer students, you know, the list goes on, right? And over the time, while I was there, I built a research lab based on global Indigenous politics to really be a kind of radical Indigenous internationalist space. And as we progressed, you know, Palestine was a part of it. Quechua students were a part of it. Saha research was a part of it. Kanaka Maile project. You know, we were doing a lot of stuff under the guise of global Indigenous politics as a kind of shield, if you will, to not just unsettle, but to radically reinvent what it looks like to convene together at this particular university. And, you know, I had some great praise from folks like Glenn Coulthard, who was mentioned previously, and Leanne Simpson. The lab still exists. It's called Zebing Lab. Unfortunately, I think it might be going through a bit of a de-radicalization process, but that is how this goes.
That's usually how it goes.
Yeah. But so when the People's Circle for Palestine organized, you know, the lab became a place to support it. And I know other labs did too, especially in units like political science or at the Faculty of Information or elsewhere on campus, that the units themselves were not keen to outwardly support their own students.
Absolutely true. Yes.
And I was not going to allow that to be the case. And, you know, in the process became known and therefore scrutinized, no longer just burying underground, but showing, you know, the face of the mole to my colleagues. And among other kinds of discourse and things at the time, you know, it was immediately obvious to me that this could not continue for them. And that was okay. You know, letting go that lab and that space, I've had to grieve a lot, but it's okay because I know the university is never going to love me. And I'm okay with that. So I actually left the university in this milieu and joined the University of Chicago in a new department called the Department of Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity. It's the first department at the university that's been created in the past 60 or 70 years. It is nothing like my old department. It's interdisciplinary. We're organized around these three critical concepts, race, diaspora, and indigeneity. And still, it is a university that I don't feel like I belong to. And that's okay as well. And I've been really enjoying the more outwardly refusal of the University of Chicago and the burrowing and building that we're doing in our department with students that are Native Hawaiian, Chamorro, Sudanese, you know, and the kind of work that continues where we can learn how to fight together in a space that is dependent on not just our erasure and obfuscation and capture, but exists primarily because of its profiting on the genocide in Palestine and its dispossession of indigenous peoples here. And so this is a new sort of moment for me, and I'm happy to talk more about that. But I also just want to, end by saying again that it's always been apparent to me that there are those down the corridor to fight, and that's true here too. And there are also those in the room that I'm energized to fight with and alongside.
Uahikea, there's so much there that you said that I want to unravel. But I want to also come back to the point about these past few years. We talked about the genocide in Gaza and Palestine and how you were involved in helping the students from the encampment at UFT. But I want to ask all of you the question about how would you define these past few years since October 2023 as revealing a side of the university that you have either already been observing and studying for some time now, or that also generates new questions for you? I'm trying to think about what's changed since October 2023 for you as kind of intellectuals and people working in university, but also as a human being in responding.
Okay, let me start by saying I am not surprised by what I am seeing in terms of the university and where it's at in this moment. I am also happy, actually, that it's being revealed. So I'm not at all sad that we are witnessing what we already knew. And for those of us who have been in community and have dealt with institutions, there is a continuity in terms of the practices of institutions, all of them, because of the way that capital and capitalism and settler colonial and racism has shaped the nation, right? The institutions reverberate all of these things, upon which the nation is constructed, right? So I am not surprised because I've had these battles in institutions. I have had battles in institutions around, diversity, around inclusion, around question of racism. And I see a pattern and a continuity when I came into the institution. Mm-hmm. So I am not surprised at where we are here today. What I am witnessing more than ever, and I think what is sort of becoming even more apparent, is the question of fascism. As Black activists, we know that fascism existed. Fascism didn't start with Germany. There was always a question of fascism. What Black people experienced during slavery and afterward was the way that racism and fascism operated on Black people's bodies. We misunderstood fascism, right? What we are seeing is the way that fascism has reared its head in particular ways as different to that we have seen in Europe, because people can only identify with fascism in Europe. And I think people were not prepared for what was happening in terms of the fact that institutions and governments were willing to weigh down on those who dare to oppose the state of Israel and government policies on the protection of Israel, at the expense of genociding Palestinians. And it took a lot of people a long time to actually start to believe that there was a genocide going on. But that genocide didn't start with October 7th either. Right? It's over 100 years war that has been happening in Palestine. If I remember it as a young 20-something-year-old, I know that there was a war in Palestine. I know that Palestinians were fighting the Zionist regime for decades, were trying to free themselves. But I think what we have witnessed now is that there was a possibility, I believe very strongly, that there was a possibility that this war could have been won in people's mind, that Palestine might have been able to free itself at some point. And no one wanted that to happen, meaning in the West and Israel. They wanted to make sure that there was no opportunity that Palestine could free itself. So we all had to witness the complete folding into this particular context of fascism and the rise of anti-Palestinian hate and the genocide of Palestine. We were being forced to swallow that. I honestly believe when Hamas did what it did, if people had risen up then, and say Free Palestine at that point, and people had joined in the support, there might have been an opportunity. I want to be hopeful, but no one was willing to let that happen because the West is very much invested in the expansion of the state of Israel. It's very much invested in the destruction of the Palestinian people. It's very much invested in occupying those lands, as we're seeing what is happening in Lebanon, and we're seeing what is happening in Iran, the complete control of the Middle East because of resources. We are seeing what is happening here. They had an agenda way ahead. That agenda was already fixed, and we were being forced everywhere as people to follow it. And if we didn't, we were being really attacked and undermined. So you see Jews and you see white-skinned people also bearing the brunt of what we recognize as Black people and as Palestinians being called animals. I mean, we as Black and brown people recognize those kinds of narratives. We were all called animals at one point. So we understood all of that, but we were witnessing how white and Jews also bearing the brunt because it was bigger than in those moments. Those who opposed Israel and the Western agenda had already surrendered to a particular kind of racialization in that moment, of the kind of violence that comes to the bodies of Black and brown people. Just to say, in terms of me coming to the university and what I'm witnessing now, I'm not surprised, but I'm also kind of happy because I think it really shook us. It shook people. People now see that you can't trust the university. You can't trust the state. This is the moment for us to continue to push back. This is the moment for us to create something different. This is the moment for something new to be created. And that should be our agenda now.
Thank you, Bev. You brought up a very important topic that I was going to ask a question about anyway, which is fascism. But I'm going to let Rinaldo respond to the question about how, if anything, events since October 2023 has revealed a side to the university or side to your observation and studying the university that was not apparent before, or that was made more apparent since then. Rinaldo.
Much like Bev, I was not surprised. But I hope that what has been revealed and exposed for people who would be surprised is that the university is one of the pillars of the state, but it is not outside the state. That so many people who work and make their lives in the university see the university space as a space of exception. And I think that, the university's response to the moment of October 7/23 revealed exactly where the university lands in the social organization of our lives. Right. And I think furthermore, the university decided that it was actually going to now fully inhabit that. It was going to actually reassert its already originary moments of violence and social organization by insisting that people toe the line that it articulated. And this is why, the student protests against genocide was so harshly smashed. But I want to say that one of the things that is really crucial about the late modern university is its relationship to capital, its relationship to being a fundamental part of the uneven distribution of capital. So that this idea that young people all need a degree to be able to enter the capitalist economy gets regulated through the university. So the university understands itself as not being in the business of education and pedagogy, but as being in the business of the distribution of capital and who will have access to it. And because of that, the university is in the business of who gets to live and who gets to die. And I think that, the blunt reality of October 7, 2023 is the university fully exposed itself in a moment of what became the pretext to genocide and then genocide, fully exposed itself as saying, yeah, those people can die. We're clear now about who the university considers can die. Now, 80 years prior, through eugenics and so on, they also made those kinds of claims, right? But at the moment of the 50s, late 50s and 60s, they stepped back. They offered us the fictive myth of being a liberal democratic space of deliberation and so on. October 7, 23, forget deliberation. forget the fiction of liberal democratic space. No, we're going to be very clear and sort out who gets to live and who gets to die. And I hope that those people who believe that the university is a space of exception have been able to see more clearly what the university actually functions as in late modern capital. So for me, my changed relationship to the university in this moment is to be even more antagonistic than I used to be, which is to say that at every step of the way, my work is to remind people of the work that the university actually does in organizing social life, that the university is itself an instrument of violence, a fundamental instrument of violence. Of course, then that places those of us who make our living in the university in profoundly paradoxical positions. But there are other ways to respond to that paradox and that contradiction, as some of my colleagues have had, as insurgents, as moles, as ways of bringing into the institution practices of being and ways of articulating what life can be. That keeps pushing back because we're fighting on all fronts. Some people fight on the street, some people fight in the institution. We're fighting on all fronts. And I think once we're aware of that, we have a very different relationship to the university than if we come to the university acting as though it's in a state of exception.
Absolutely.
I think Bev and Rinaldo teed it up really well and comprehensively. So I want to pick up where Rinaldo left off when thinking about the university in a kind of late modern sense as a neoliberal institution that, I guess, let's say to periodize it, before October 2023 and the Hamas operation, Al-Aqsa flood, was perceived to, especially in the Canadian post-secondary context, to be an exceptional place for Indigenous people, knowledge, hires, resources, as distinct from the United States. And we could talk about that, but I'll save that conversation for another time. It was really clear to me joining the university in 2019 that was the case. There's money to hire faculty that are distinctly self-identifying as Indigenous, First Nation, Métis, but also Native Hawaiian, Alaskan Native, American Indian, et cetera, et cetera. So there's an influx, right, across Canadian post-secondary institutions, especially of faculty and Canada Research Chair positions, labs, all of these things. And so you have to ask yourself the question, and this is mostly for listeners, not for us, but why? And that's a lot of it has to do with the distribution of capital, like Rinaldo was saying, post the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada in 2015, and the response from post-secondary institutions like U of T to reconcile with the history of what was called cultural genocide in 2015, but because of the 2018-2019 National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Queer Folks, genocide. So the influx of money, of resources, of capital to do hires, to create buildings, et cetera, was pretty palpable when I arrived, especially coming from the US context, and perceivably exceptional for that. There were jobs, right? I had 2 offers in Canada, 0 offers anywhere else at the end of the day in that job market season. And the reason why I'm saying this is because there was this idea of fetish, of tokenism, of exclusive inclusion or inclusive exclusion, however you want to describe it, for Indigenous programming and resources, whether for hiring, for programs, for projects, research, etc. So there was a kind of moment of fetishism that, to me, stands distinct from the October 2023 moment. Let me just explain a little bit. In order to access, receive, and utilize those resources, there was a kind of performance that was normative, in my view. And there were sort of good natives or good Indigenous people, and that could be legitimately granted this type of capital to do things, research, teaching, etc. And then post-October 23, there were bad natives that were lambasted in right-wing conservative Toronto news reports, along with others that were, bad subjects, let's say, terrorist sympathizers and whatnot. And, that was a clear flashpoint moment for me precisely because of the exceptionalism post-TRC in post-secondary institutions in Canada. Some Indigenous people that were workers in the university or in other institutions like museums, etc., went from pet to threat. No longer were they monikers or objects to be collected that could then be construed as fulfilling some kind of distribution of capital as reparative to compete for whatever is referred to as reconciliation in, their eyes and their missions and mandates. Indigenous peoples that were advocating for Palestinians or cheering for the breaking free of peoples from the largest open-air prison in the world in Gaza were considered the bad natives, or as Deborah Miranda puts it in her really amazing memoir, Bad Indians, in addition to being criminals and terrorist sympathizers and all these things. But it created this delineation between who's good and who's bad in that sort of institutional neoliberal sense, and who then is worthy of these resources, who then is worthy of promotion, who then, can continue to walk the halls with colleagues. So that was a really clear, bright line for me. But, it was really useful because it unmasked, as has already been said, the colleagues that cheered on the genocide, the colleagues that benefited from partnerships with Hebrew University, the colleagues that benefited from partnerships with Hebrew University that then went on to become the president of the University of Toronto. The programs, the resources, all of these things, to Bev's point, was really useful to see and not unprecedented per se, thinking about apartheid South Africa and all sorts of other moments in global history of our time. But I also want to make another point in this regard, and then I'll kind of wrap up because I know we have other questions. This was also true of those in our own communities, right? Those in Indigenous studies, let's say, those in OISE, that we considered comrades and colleagues. And the regulatory and disciplinary apparatus of the university seeped in to our communities post-October 23. And in some cases, it was like a lightning rod. And in other cases, it was gradual. But I still found that to be useful, to count who would show up when needed and who would allow for these terrible, dizzying events to continue. And so I do want to say that this continues to be the case, with other kinds of dates and moments with regard to what's taken place in the abduction of Nicolas Maduro, with the assault in Iran, like the continued genocide in Sudan. Like there are a lot of these different kinds of moments. And I do think that it's important for those listening to interrogate them not as exceptional moments, but as quasi-events in a longer durée of fascism, of white supremacy, of settler colonialism that then gets rerouted to consider who is good and who is bad, when really we should be blowing those categories up in addition to those that create them.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was really important to hear and to think about. Bev, go on. Yeah.
Following Uahikea's point. Thank you for that, both you and Rinaldo. As you ended with the point, that these are momentary quasi, but I also want us to also connect where we as Indigenous and Black people in this particular kind of struggle intersect and where there are specificities. And I want to say that in 2020, a whole bunch of Black scholars were also hired after the uprising. And I guess the connection I'm trying to make here is that these kinds of moments at the university where they perform, right? But they perform in ways that, while bringing us into the university, is meant to also locate us and isolate us in particular ways with respect to the institution itself, that we are brought in a particular way and we are captured in a particular way, that we find ourselves knotted in this institutional capture. Some of us who came from the struggle, those who came from the revolutionary struggle on the ground and entered the university, had hope that we can influence the institution to move away from its investment in a colonial framework, right? Mm-hmm. I know for myself and the people I went in from the ground with, these are some of the things we had hope. And even when I look at some of my feminist sisters, Black sisters, who said that I will never stay in this institution. I will go in, it's a job. I need to feed my family. I need to pay my rent. But I understand that this institution cannot hold me. I don't want it to hold me. And I understand it cannot hold what I bring to it either, right? Because it is not the kind of place where that change is going to happen. So I just wanted to kind of make a connection there in terms of what you were talking about, in which indigenous scholars were taken up within the institution. Very similarly that Black scholars were taken up in that way, and who succumbed to the institutions, but who, like yourself, continue to push back or to find ways to be the mole or the insurgent who will refuse and continue to refuse some of that. So I just wanted to make that connection and to thank you for that.
I think one of the things that we have to really grapple with in terms of the university itself is what happened after the Commission on Reconciliation up until, let's say, I would say from about 2017 to about 2023. There's something happening in the university, at least in the Canadian context, where the response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is now beginning to really fully get some kind of foothold through bringing in Indigenous scholars, not only from Turtle Island, but globally. And simultaneously, at least in the institutions that I'm familiar with, Black faculty who've been previously in those institutions are working to see if there's any possibility for the extension and the proliferation of Black faculty. Then 2020 happens, the George Floyd moment, and a number of institutions do these cluster hires. But all of that happens in a context where the normative university doesn't actually really want to do any of that. It's actually shamed into doing it. And in every instance, it's trying to find individuals who will be pliable to its own conservative underpinnings. And in that case, some people slip through who are not pliant to its own conservative underpinnings. And then October 7, 23 happens. And those particular people who slip through end up becoming public enemy number one inside the institution. They end up being targeted inside and beyond the institution. And they become the example, again, another moment of exposing exactly what the institution is about. Because the institution doesn't stand for that, right? The institution cuts them off, leaves them on their own to deal with whatever forces beyond the institution are coming for them. But if we bring this down to University of Toronto, in 2016, when Jordan Peterson announces himself on the scene by attacking trans students, and by 2017, 2018, decided that he's going to attack ethnic studies, women and gender studies, and so on, we also saw how the university did everything in its power to protect him. And so the university is constantly showing us that it is not a space of progressive social formation. And again, those of us who are willing to see that, we see it very clearly. But the university is skilled at recruiting people who believe in its fictions and who believe also in a certain kind of individualism, that they believe in the story of merit. They believe in the story of their specialness. Mm-hmm. And those of us who are committed to kind of collective social transformation will always find ourselves at odds in the university. But that doesn't mean that we abandon it. That means that we buckle down on recognizing that it's one of the sites within which serious political struggle has to be waged. And so for me, it's like really important to notice how the university tries to contain and how it works arm in arm with other state and private institutions to contain what is the potential for revolutionary practice.
I think I don't have to ask my other questions. You've been like, this is a great conversation. I'm going to keep the conversation going. If the university as an institution is beyond reform, as all of you have already articulated, then what is the role of the intellectual at this present moment? I'm thinking of intellectuals like Edward Said, but also Stuart Hall. Both would take politics seriously in determining the best political intellectual way of intervening in politics. And all three of you, through your work, gesture to another path, another way, whether it's anti-colonial liberation, abolitionism, a form of freedom that does not rely on the current existing patterns of domination and capitalist relationality. So my question for all of you is there a way of rearticulating, reimagining another university now?
I'll start by just saying that I think what 2020 in terms of the uprising has done, and what I think I've seen after October 7th, in terms of the urgency by many, I would say radical and revolutionary intellectuals are doing, is stuff like this online. I think we need to go back to the corners. We need to go to the commons. We need to create learning outside what we understand as the institution. I think the encampment was a good example of housing and holding teachings and education right outside of the embodied institution, where everyone can sit and engage with each other. I mean, this is not new, right? Where there's always been, Black activist conversations. I mean, I grew up in a context of public education and public intellectualism, where you gather at a street corner, you gather in a park, you gather in different places where everyone can have access and where you can have conversations that challenges, the institutions and the state. And I think we need to do more of it. I think we need to really keep taking this outside of the institution. Like Rinaldo, I disagree with Hani and Moten that we should hide. I don't believe in hiding. I don't believe that I want to hide in the institution. I've never done that. I don't hide, period. If you want me, you know where to find me. I believe that we need to take all of this out. And I try to do that with my students, where we leave the university. I try to teach courses that doesn't depend on us staying in the institution, but that we go to a street art somewhere, that we talk about what this is trying to say to us. That we start taking students outside of the institutions as much as possible, so they learn that the institution is not the only place that holds knowledge, that is not the only place that we can engage, that is not the only place that change can happen, that it's from the university to the street, from the street to the university. There's a flow, right? And I try to encourage that. So that is where I would start. And then, I'm not trying to sell Scholar Strike Liberation, but I am. In the sense that, that's the kind of work that I'm hoping, that I'm trying to do. And I know that has made it possible for me to be in the institution right now, doing that work that pushes me outside of those limits and that allow me to also engage people, my colleagues, my activists, my friends, outside of these parameters. So I'll stop there.
No, thank you.
As I was saying last night, I come from a tradition in which Black scholars and thinkers are always kind of willing to risk something. And so, I think there's something useful in the commons. I just don't think it gets us to where we need to, if you will, arrive. Not that there's a clearly focused, articulated endpoint, but it doesn't vault beyond what we need to vault beyond. I don't think, if I understand my Renage right, that those who were Maroons always wanted to remain Maroons. They wanted to settle and create spaces of freedom. The Colombo didn't want to be forever hiding and surrounded by unfreedom. It wanted to come into its fullest self. So I think there are some limits to what Harney and Moulton articulated on the Commons. I rather turn towards Walter Rodney and the Groundlings of My Brothers, who went to the street corner, hang out with the Rasta men, and shared with them, but also learned from them, who went to the Union Hall, who went to the cane fields, shared with them and learned from them. And of course, that's a different kind of logic of community formation and building. And that ultimately led to his demise. I think after October 7, 2023, the possibility that people in the university and people beyond the university would come together was a real threat. It was a real threat to the social regime of normative life. And so those kinds of connections also had to be broken. I think that the student protests really placed the university as an institution in a broader network of community formations. And the university didn't like that kind of exposure. It didn't like having to account for its naughty relationship in capital. At the University of Toronto, they've got this thing called the Mount School of Global Affairs.
Yes.
Funded by the late philanthropist Peter Monk, who founded Barrick Gold. You know, just this past Sunday, I was 2 hours outside of Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, in a small town where Barrick Gold has a major mine. Not only was I paying witness to the scarred earth of this mine, but we met with the people in that community, people whose bones suddenly break, people who go suddenly blind. Their water is not drinkable. They can't even bathe their children in their water because their skin erupts in all kinds of things. The University of Toronto has never made public the terms of the philanthropy that has led to the founding of the Mount School of Global Affairs and the beautiful building that they have built and the reclaimed colonial building that sits perfectly on Bloor Street as this flagship school. These are the kinds of naughty relations that the students were exposing after October 7, 2023. And the university saw itself as potentially vulnerable. And therefore, it responded in the way that it responded. It responded as capital always does, violently. Whenever capital is apprehended, it responds violently. For those of us who are analysts of the university, we have all of the evidence that we need to demonstrate, as many people say vernacularly, that most of our universities, but particularly the University of Toronto in the context of Canada, are financial and real estate institutions with education as a side gig, as a subsidiary. Now, of course, in some ways, the University of Toronto is singular in that sense in the Canadian scene, but this is a model that is quickly becoming global, that almost every place in the world now, universities are picking up this model of financializing and ensconcing themselves inside capital. So again, you know, I began by saying one of the things that we see universities doing is universities have become a kind of management for the distribution of capital. And the way that they do that is to subordinate students, particularly, into the regime of capital through the way in which they expose them to knowledge. So people like us who are on this podcast and the kind of work that we do, that is not that our work is meaningless, but we are there or offered a space there as a way for the university to make or maintain its fictive claims of democratic liberalism. But ultimately, we are the sideshow in the larger enterprise that the university now is. And again, when we expose that as both individuals and groups of people, we become subject to the violence of the institution. We saw that so clearly at the University of Toronto with the way in which Jordan Peterson was able to terrorize students, staff, and faculty. The university never once spoke out in opposition to the ways in which he behaved inside the institution. October 7, 2023, how many faculty were called into dean's offices, suspended, and so on? We can see the stark differences. And we can see those differences, and we can then see what they mean socially and politically, what kind of regimes they keep in place. And I'll leave it at that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Really a lot to think about and all truth, all of it. Uahikea.
I don't think that my word should be last after hearing both Bev and Rinaldo. So I'll just say this. In the Hawaiian tradition of the intellectual in the university, in kind of modern sense, I look up to Haunani-Kay Trask, who was a Native Hawaiian feminist, nationalist, orator, professor extraordinaire. She passed away in 2021 on July 3rd as a final what many of us believe to be a final fuck you to the United States right before Independence Day on July 4th. And really good colleague of mine who works at the University of Hawaii, Noelani Gudjakopua, told me after she passed away, Haunani-Kay Trask, that her work won't stop as long as we keep replicating it and as long as we continue her tradition, share her words, and inspire our students to be slyly reproductive in their various modes of production and resistance. So in that sense, I just want to end by kind of succinctly mediating on this question of the role of the intellectual in the university in that regard, to say that in Haunani-Kay Trask's tradition, I hope to be a thorn that doesn't disintegrate and stays and annoys and irritates and potentially festers, a larger wound, if you will, a thorn. But I also hope to be, in my work, a rose and something that grows and is constantly watered and planted and propagates elsewhere, that then produces more thorns and more plants through its seeds. And that's a lesson that I've learned from not just Haunani-Kay Trask, but many others, and that this work can be done simultaneously, as I think both Rinaldo and Bev are also gesturing to. And that is a life that is what my colleague Nick Estes has referred to as very pure. And I do think that that is a important lesson that Haunani-Kay Trask has given to many Kanaka Maoli, but also non-Kanaka Maoli as well. And she learned it from Malcolm X, and she learned it from Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Black feminists and Third World revolutionary struggle. And she became the leader in many respects of the modern Hawaiian sovereignty movement. And, posthumously has produced this brilliant, beautiful flower and rose, if you will, which is the School of Hawaiian Knowledge at the University of Hawaii. While not perfect, still today cultivates both more plants and thorns in the university's side.
That's a great metaphor to end this conversation, but I want to say I had benefited so much from talking to the three of you. I can't imagine a better gift than having the three of you in the room with me and having this conversation. I have a question, though, that is something you might want to think about. We think here on this podcast series that the three of you are amazing scholars, but also kick-ass scholars, and we want to know what inspires you. If there was one song that inspires you in ways that brings you back to that place that you feel centered and also motivated to continue doing what you do.
This is going to seem like a cop-out, but it's not. It's an entire album. It's Bob Marley's Uprising. So you can choose any song from the album.
Okay. I knew you I'm sorry, but I guessed right in my head. I knew you were going to go to Bob Marley, but thank you.
Well, I mean, what comes to my head now is Talking About a Revolution by Tracy Chapman.
Thank you. That's a great choice.
I immediately thought of the song, but I have a complicated relationship with it because it's also really sad and somber, but inspiring. It's called Hawaiian Soul, and it's a song by the former head of the School of Hawaiian Knowledge at the University of Hawaii, John Osorio, who's a longtime activist and advocate and historian. His daughter is Jamaica Heoli Osorio, who's also professor and activist at the university. They have a band together. I went to school with her and her brother, Duncan. They're all musicians, but he wrote this song in dedication to a Hawaiian soul that was lost at sea, George Helm, battling the U.S. Army and Navy and military from its prolonged occupation of one of our islands, Koho'olave. And his name is George Helm. So the song is dedicated to him and his life of revolutionary resistance and the Hawaiian movement. And it's somber and sad, but it's also inspiring of the kind of life that I think many of us want to live, although we're not always willing to sacrifice.
That's three amazing contributions. I want to thank you again. I've taken up so much of your time, and you've gifted me with your presence and your voice and your time. So I want to just say that we hope to continue to have you in our lives, in my life. And I just can just say thank you again.
Thank you, Girish. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
This podcast series was created for the 10th anniversary of the platform Everyday Orientalism. and in conversation with its editors, Catherine Bloy and Osama Ali Gad. To find more content and to subscribe, you can visit everydayorientalism.wordpress.com. This podcast was recorded at the University of Toronto. The land that the University of Toronto is on has always been Indigenous land. In 1827, the British King gave over 200,000 acres of Indigenous land appropriated by the Crown to the Anglican bishop to establish King's College. We wish to acknowledge that despite this history of settler colonialism, for thousands of years, this has always been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I would like to thank our research assistant Sophie Plotkin and our editor and producer Taylor Stark for helping make this podcast possible. Thank you for listening.